My name is Jim Kane. I'm with the Residential Education Group in ODL. We created this Lightboard about 5 years ago. Before I actually get into the details, into the weeds of what the Lightboard Studio is, I wanted to acknowledge the contributions of several people. First off, Professor John Brisson, who had the foresight to fund the building of the first Lightboard Studio and the confidence that we could actually pull this all together in a very short period of time. Also would like to acknowledge Oliver Thomas, who helped connect all of the dots, people and resources to make this happen. Two people in physics, Dr. Peter Dormashkin and Dr. Michelle Tomasic, who over the first 3 or 4 years of the Lightboard Studio worked the heck out of it and actually helped us improve the workflow, and they evangelized this capture process across campus. Over those 3 or 4 years, they've created somewhere on the order of 500 short videos for first-year physics students. And then the last two people I'd like to acknowledge are Dr. Aaron Kessler, who's a colleague of mine in my office, and Lauren Totino, who have created a self-paced learning module on the MITx platform, which will help you learn a little bit more about the technology involved with Lightboard Studio, but a lot more about the pedagogical aspects of integrating this technology into your teaching and learning. So what is a Lightboard? Let me go ahead and tell you what a Lightboard is not. A Lightboard is not new, innovative technology. A Lightboard is old, reliable technology with traditional capture techniques mixed in new, innovative workflows. So we're not using something that's going to break easily, something that needs a lot of support. Okay, the people who are responsible for this capture technology or this capture technique are Michael Peshkin at Professor Michael Peshkin at Northwestern University and Professor Matt Anderson at San Diego State University. This is Professor Peshkin at Northwestern explaining the Lightboard. Now there is no audio for this video. I've intentionally muted that so I can talk over him. You can access the entire video at that URL, lightboard.info. What you'll see Dr. Peshkin doing here is explaining the different advantages of this type of capture technique. And what the biggest thing that you'll notice is that you actually see Dr. Peshkin from the front. You don't see a capture where you're shooting over his shoulder and he's writing on a chalkboard, obscuring things that are on the chalkboard. You can't, where you wouldn't be able to see what he's pointing to, what he's talking about, what he's gesturing towards. In this case, he's actually facing the camera, looking, pointing, gesturing at various aspects of the capture. So our Lightboard Studio looks something like this. This is the first Lightboard Studio that we created. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is the Lightboard itself. And again, it's not special technology. It's a sheet of glass with LED edge lighting. The picture on the lower right is a picture of the same Lightboard and the capture workstation. Okay, so that capture workstation is, as you see in this picture, will capture not only a feed from the talent camera. In this case, we've got John Hart from Mechanical Engineering behind the Lightboard, but it will also allow you to composite other video sources. So even though John Hart looks like he's gesturing to thin air behind the Lightboard, he's actually speaking to some of his PowerPoint slides, which he can actually see in front of him about 10 feet in front. Those two video feeds get composited together to form one video feed, which can be quickly turned around and then posted to whatever your favorite video source outlet is. Here's a floor plan of the video of the Lightboard Studio that we have right now. It's about 15 feet by 18 feet. The talent stands back here behind a sheet of glass. And on the other side is a camera about 8 feet away from the sheet of glass, which captures the talent through the glass. Behind that camera is a reference monitor so that the talent can see what they're writing, see where their position is relative to the writing. And if they've got a second video feed, they can actually see what that video feed looks like so that they can gesture to it on the glass as I'm doing now. So I can point to things that are being composited interactively on this video screen. In this case, the capture workstation, where the reference monitor is and so forth. Another reason for having that reference monitor back there is so that the talent, again, doesn't talk to the audience, the virtual audience, through the graphics. they can actually see themselves, so they can position themselves so that they are clearly visible. Well, what can we do with this? We can actually capture multiple presentation styles with just one simple workflow. We can do a simple chalkboard lecture using a stylus, vertical writing surface, and an audience. That's what we excel at. It's very easy to do. You can do a weatherman style composite, which is what I'm doing right now, where I'm capturing not only the talent, but also a second video input, in this case, a PowerPoint deck. Or you can do some other fancier capture techniques, a tablet style capture like a Khan Academy. In this case, we would just turn off all the studio lights except for the lightboard lights, and it would just appear like handwriting appearing on a slate. Or you can do voiceover video, all with one simple workflow, so you don't have to learn multiple workflows. The advantages of the Lightboard Studio is that you're using normal lecture mechanics, stylus, vertical surface, talking to the audience. Okay, it's just that simple. It's hard to break. And you don't have to change your lecture mechanics at all. For the audience, the advantages are that you have multiple contextual clues. So they can see where I'm pointing, they can see where I'm looking, they can see my mouth moving. They can see if I get all the way down to the bottom of this derivation, a 10-minute derivation, and my eyebrow goes up and I stop talking for 10 seconds, they instantly realize that minus sign that I see here should have been a plus sign. So those contextual clues allow them to gather a lot more information than just watching someone's back at a chalkboard. The other advantages of this style of capture are that it's time efficient. So typically for capture and post-processing, it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. So about 2 hours of time to generate 1 hour of usable video. That can be less or more depending on your tolerance for quality. And it's also quick turnaround. Typically these types of videos, you're going to be cutting off the heads and the tails and then posting them to YouTube. We've set up the studio to be self-service so that all of the captures can be started and stopped from behind the glass with a simple touchpad like this, just a few simple buttons. And again, as I mentioned before, there's a flexible, you have many different presentation styles that you can capture. And the workflow is really, really simple. It's a matter of turning on the proper lights, putting on a wireless lavalier microphone, and starting the capture. These are the elements that you're going to see in the studio when you first arrive. These are the elements that are most important to you. The capture workstation, which is running off-the-shelf software that you'll need to start. It's very simple to do. A set of pens, fluorescent markers, dry erase, wet erase markers, a wireless lavalier microphone, and some Windex. The other element, if you're going to be capturing by yourself, is familiarizing yourself with a touchpad. And that's about it for the Lightboard Studio.
Jim, thank you so much. We have some time if people have questions. Ari Epstein, go ahead, Ari.
Hey, thanks so much. This is such a fabulous thing to have access to. Just a very small question. Do you have the capability of appearing in front of the PowerPoint slide as well as behind it? I saw that your sort of hand is behind it, but for true weatherman style, there might be so much on the image that you'd like your hand to be in front of that.
That is a great question, Ari. We do not currently have that capability as a turnkey solution. We can do it by moving a green screen back here, but then by putting a green screen behind the talent, that takes away the ability to capture certain types of markers on the video camera. The other way to do that, that we've looked into, so that would be using a chroma key technique with a green screen behind the talent. The other way to do that would be using a luma key technique where you're pulling out the more luminous elements. In this case, my green shirt's not very luminous, but being able to pull that out and composite that onto an image. And there are several drawbacks with that, and we just haven't done that. Now, one of those drawbacks is that the talent's pupils are going to be very dark. So those elements would appear transparent on the alpha channel, and things that were back here would show through my eyes. It would be kind of eerie.
Thanks, that'll be very helpful for preparing slides. Really appreciate it, thank you.
Yep.
Paul Mende, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I would. When you're doing multi-board derivations, do you pause the video, erase, and start over? And do you have any way to help the audience manage the context? I'm used to lecturing in a room that's got 6 blackboards, and one thing I realize is that in addition to the convenience of moving things to shoulder level, the students can go back 2 or 3 boards and take a look. So how do you think about that when you design a lecture using the Lightboard?
That's a great question, Paul. You are limited to the amount of space. On this particular light board, it's about 6 feet wide by 4 feet tall. So you could fill that up probably anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes. In terms of being able to access multiple boards of content, there's a few strategies that you could use. One, the strategy that we recommend is that you don't actually capture videos that are extremely long. We're thinking more like curricular nuggets that are 5 to 10 minutes long, which is about how long it takes to fill up the board. So you can imagine that if you had multiple videos of 5 to 10 minutes long, it's possible to juxtapose those together so that, if you're downloading these and doing them on QuickTime, you could do what you're talking about. It's not optimal, but that would be my best recommendation right now.
Let's move to Professor Anna Friebel, next person to share their experience teaching with a Lightboard.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm a professor in the physics department. I have not prepared a slideshow or anything, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how I got into doing quite a lot with the Lightboard. Quite a few years ago, I was teaching 801 with Peter Domashkin and Michelle Tomasek, and I was still kind of new to teaching physics classes, and I wanted to get some experience and in the classroom. And so I volunteered to do some Lightboard videos simply to practice doing the small chunks of equations and concepts on the whiteboard in the classroom. This is how I discovered that I really like the whiteboard. It turns out I much prefer the one big eye in front of my nose rather than 100 pairs of eyes, in my back. So it was facing one or the other, I feel. And this not having to constantly turn over to address the students and then make sure that I turn to the left side of the room once, and then the next time I turn to the right side of the room, because if you're teaching in a large room, that's always a challenge. And so I really came to love the Lightboard, and it gave me really good practice doing it there, doing it perhaps sometimes even multiple times until I got it just right. And then I could also do it much more easily in the classroom, but I still had to do the turning and the whole thing. So that's how I started. Eventually, I figured that this would be a good medium to try something completely different, much more research related. So what I did is I wrote a series of 11 pieces that detail the basics of my own work, and also happened to be a summary of the book that I had written a few years beforehand. And so together with Michelle, a few years ago, just after Christmas, for 2 days, we just, shot this all one after another. And of course, I knew the material really well, and it was really nice to kind of have a really concise summary of my work. And I often refer interested people now to that YouTube series. OCW actually picked it up about a year ago. And so it's available there as well now as a sort of a mini course. I had never intended for that. So that just happened a couple years later or so. But apparently they're interested in mini series like that. So I would actually like to encourage postdocs and faculty to use the Lightboard much more for their own purposes and just use it to tell a story. So each of these 11 pieces, and you can, if you put my name in YouTube, you'll find it, is just one card. Basically, I would buy these paper cards, and then I would plan each of the segments on just one card. It's just one take, and it's about 5 to 8 minutes. And there's a good amount of things you can bring across in that amount of time and with that amount of material. So it's a really nice bite-sized chunk. And so inspired by that, I decided to take one step further. I was then teaching the introduction to astronomy and astrophysics, freshman class. And I had done that a few times, and I'd always given the students a semester project. So, and there was always something related to outreach in some way, but I still wanted them to learn some good skills, not necessarily technical skills, but just something useful. And so I eventually decided, it was sort of going over 2 years, but in the second year, I managed to have the students pair up in teams of 2 and have all 12 pairs do one of these exact Lightboard segments. That was for my outreach, for my NSF grant, where we take astronomy terminology that you find in the shop. Let's say the Mars candy bar. Mars is a planet in the solar system. Most people don't realize that anymore when they bite into their bar. And so my project is about teaching the science behind these terms that you see in the shop. There are many if you actually look around, and so it took a lot of time, and my infant son came to all of the sessions, but he was always quiet enough. And I had 2 students at the Lightboard kind of go back and forth. We practiced that, and they wrote each part, and it turned into sort of a conversation, and it was quite challenging for many at the beginning, but they all mastered it about the 3rd, sometimes 4th time. And it's really great to spend about 2 hours with them and really coach them about how to present themselves in front of the camera. They had to, of course, develop their science case and do that. I would only rarely actually have to correct any of that. And then to kind of see them grow. Some people were absolutely natural talents. That's like, wow, give me a camera and here I'm gonna switch right on, right? And for others, took a little bit of time to warm up, but I think everyone enjoyed that experience and getting a little bit of sort of camera experience and teaching of training, of course, science communication, right? How do I take a science concept and reformulate such that anyone, any layperson in the street can now understand what the deal is with Mars and why they should care. So that's the last thing I did. That was 1.5 years ago. I'm still finalizing that project, so that's not available yet. But hopefully next summer or so, you can all see that when it's done. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Friebel. I actually have a question for you. I was wondering if you talked about using the Lightboard to tell a story, which I thought was really interesting. And I was wondering if there are particular concepts or particular sequences of concepts that really get clarified when they're expressed through the Lightboard that might not be so in a different medium.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare to a podcast, right, that's audio only. You just have to use your words. You can only rely on the descriptions that you can speak. The Lightboard gives you the additional dimension that you can basically scribble something on the board, like you'd be sitting with someone and doing just scribbling something on a piece of paper, right? Back of the envelope type calculation. So that's kind of how I see it. I would always put one sort of drawing on the board first, so I wouldn't lose time drawing this in real time, and I'm a terrible drawer, so that wouldn't have worked anyway. So I'd always have this already started, so I wouldn't look all dark, and then basically structure my little story around the sort of graph or cartoon I would have there. And I think it just makes it a little bit easier for the audience to follow what you're talking about without getting a really full-on lecture, with many equations that take time to write and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. at this point, we'll move to the next panelist. So would you like to share your experience, Professor Rayo?
Yes, I would love to share my experience. The main thing I want to convey to people is that Lightboard really works for me. So it was a watershed moment in my digital teaching experience. So most of what I've done is focused on a class, which is both a MOOC and also just an MIT residential class. And you know, what happened to me, and I'm sure it's happened to others too, is that I discovered that creating digital contents is really hard. And not just that, but also that just as a professor, one doesn't have the skills that are required to do it properly, at least not automatically. So I kept thinking that, you know, what was needed was an actor, not a professor, and you know, and someone who had studied, you know, television or cinematography, not a philosopher. So I tried many different things, not very successfully. So you know, I made efforts of trying to like imitate what professionals do, trying to have these like very high production value things, and you know, and I wasn't very good at it, and it, you know, just a huge time commitment. And I also tried the the other end of the spectrum by basically, you know, just filming my residential lectures. But as I discovered that is also not ideal. I mean, partly for reasons Jim was describing. And Lightboard sort of hit the sweet spot for me because it allowed me to use the skills that I have already just as a residential teacher to produce contents that I think really do work in a digital learning context. And it's not just that I could use the tools that I have, like, you know, speaking while using Chalkboard or speaking while using slides. It's also that as Jim emphasized, it's sort of very easy to do. It's very low overhead. So, you know, when I was doing these, I basically convinced Jim to meet with me once a week, and we would just shoot one or two of these a week, and it was like effortless. You know, I would think about what to do on the way to Jim's studio, and that was it. So unlike the, you know, all the time it would take to take these, to make these professionally aspiring videos, you know, I could just make as many of these as I wanted. So for example, one thing I discovered I could do was if during my residential lecture, something didn't quite work. Like for example, I was proving something and I, you know, got mixed up in the middle and had to go back. Then I would just go to Jim's studio and like do it properly. And then that same day, post it for my students to you know, get the proper version of the proof. And then that's wonderful because it you know, it means that there's the opportunity to engage with one's students that would be totally absent if you know, if I spent, you know, 3 weeks or more developing a content.
Thank you, Professor Rayo. Do folks have questions or comments for Professor Rayo? Something came to mind when you were talking, I wanted to ask you. It sounded like it was an easy transition to write on this clear surface and perhaps maybe even more conducive to ideation than writing on a white or a black surface, that there's something actually freeing about it being clear from your experience, the experience of writing on it. Is that the case?
So, I mean, I don't know if this will be true of everyone, but what happened to me is that it just felt much less awkward than I thought it would. So as Jim explained, when you're doing this, there's a big monitor in front of you and you can see yourself. And it seemed less awkward for me to look at myself than to just look at a camera. Just speaking to the camera is, I think, a skill that I do not have. I know how to speak to an audience, but speaking to a camera, it just requires a different skill set. So that's something that was easy. And then the other thing that was easy was just, working with something that felt like a chalkboard, which is what I normally use to explain things to students. So I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. After a while, it just felt like I could put my mind in the same zone that it's in when there's a student in my office and I'm just trying to explain something to them.
Thank you. It looks like Aaron Kessler has a question. Would you like to ask?
Hi, Professor Rayo, and this can go to Professor Frabel and Dr. Gu as well. One of the things that I'm wondering about in both of the stories we've heard so far is different ways of engaging students. So in the first one, students actually being participatory and being in the Lightboard Studio and sort of using that as a way to maybe assess or engage students in the sort of active learning process. Professor Rayo, you talked a little bit about the sort of students being able to get clarification of maybe a mistake or a change you wanted to make. And I'm curious if both of you or all three of you can speak a little bit to how that's been received by students in sort of their own learning process within your courses.
I don't actually have all that much experience because my audience has largely been like the much wider audience. There have been many positive comments on YouTube or by other means. So maybe Augustine can say a little bit more specific to the question.
So I thought it was good. So the way it worked is I would post the videos on Piazza, which I was using for my residential class. And I was able to track how many students would watch the videos. And often it was most students in the class. And I also, I mean, this is all anecdotal, but there seemed to be a correlation between how badly I messed things up in class and how popular the video was later. So I have some unscientific reason for thinking that the students appreciated having the videos there. Well, and also, I mean, this is separate from what you're asking about, but one thing that was nice about having the videos is that, of course, once I had made them in order to clarify a point in my residential class, then that video existed and I could incorporate it into my MOOC, say. So like it just felt like win-win for me.
Great. Thank you, Augustine.
I'd like to add one more comment
Sure.
to Aaron's point, and this is regarding Professor Frabel's capture with students. And it doesn't directly address the consumption of the videos and the response to the consumption, but I was privileged enough to be a fly on the wall during some of the capture. And I thought it was just simply extraordinary to watch Professor Frabel work with these undergraduate students and see this tight communication loop happening. You could palpably feel the actual learning happening with the students from one capture to the next. They would modify their presentation, the content, they would turn on a dime. So it was very nice to watch, very humbling to see. And I wish that I had had that experience when I was an undergraduate student, being able to have access to a professor. That's all I had to say.
Thank you. Dr. Joey Gu is our last panelist, and I'll hand the proceedings over to you, Joey.
All right, thanks, Molly. So hi, everyone. My name is Joey Gu, and I am the Digital Learning Fellow in Chemical Engineering. So it's my job. I help faculty in my department create digital learning content, and Lightboard has been a pretty critical component of that. So today I'm excited to share with you, I suppose, the departmental perspective of some of the good things that we've been doing with Lightboard in our department. So I'd like to begin by showing you what may be considered a standard workflow for using Lightboard. This is not the only way you can use it, and I'll show some other examples. But if you think about the conventional lecture, you can just begin by thinking about what's going to go on the board, right? So that could simply involve writing out the equations, for example, for this class, which is a graduate level class in transport phenomena, very math heavy, lots of derivations. So you can just write it out as a PDF. And then during capture, actually, there's an option to show this PDF in front of a right in front of you on a TV screen here. So you have something to reference while you're writing. And then we do the capture, right, as Jim was explaining. And then we have a video, which we can do some minor editing, and I'll show some examples of that to get our final video. So what do I think about using Lightboard? So this is some of my thoughts. So I think the two key things to note here are one, there's high production value when using Lightboard, and two, it's really intuitive to use. So what do I mean by high production value? So you're in a studio environment. So that already means a lot of things, right? You're going to have great audio. The board work is really attractive. Whenever you show someone for the first time Lightboard, they're always very excited, like, wow, how do you do that? That's really cool. Yeah, and as Jim was saying, there's a lot of contextual clues, right? You're right in front of the audience. They see your body language, they see what you're looking at. So all of that is very engaging for the students to look at. And there is some compatibility with multimedia, and I'll show some examples of that. Yeah, and I'll get into some of the other details on my later slides. But the other thing about Lightboard is that it's just so accessible and so intuitive to use. So for those of you who are part of the MIT community, it's essentially free, at least for faculty to use. And it's really easy just to go in the studio and get started, right? There isn't a lot of time just to start up. And then, obviously it's a professional studio, lots of useful tools if you get into it. And one interesting thing I like to know is that it's inherently optimized for a lot of best practices. So actually one point that was brought up was if you have a long derivation, there's only so much you can fit on one board, right? But that's actually a good thing. There's a good practice called chunking, which is not to talk about too much stuff in one video, right? So the board actually sets a natural limit for how much you can talk about. And that gives you a pretty decently sized video for the students to watch. And then maybe you can interspace questions between those videos. And that's actually a very good practice. So all of it is set up to encourage teaching in a meaningful way. And then I will talk about how it lowers the barrier for not only faculty, but also non-faculty, as we've heard about. There are also some disadvantages to using Lightboard, although I would definitely focus on the advantages here. So there's a lot of erasing. If you write, we're just writing with markers on a piece of glass, right? So you've got to have strong arms to do a lot of erasing. So that's definitely something to think about. And then the handedness is inverted because we're taking the mirror image of what the camera records, right? So if you want to be, explaining like the left-hand rule for coordinate systems or explain chirality in chemistry, well, good luck with that. You got to like explain it with the other hand and try to invert everything in your mind to make it right for the students to see. And then for multimedia stuff, there's not really an easy way to annotate, and I'll explain what that means. And then, like in our age, there are a lot of different options for doing a digital lecture. So Lightboard is only one of the options. And maybe for your project, you just need some of these reasons to really consider Lightboard. But there are also other options to consider. So it's really a case-by-case judgment for you. Okay, so now I'd like to actually ask you all to watch a video, which I will post in the Zoom chat. So just go to this link, watch the video, and then when you come back, please just type done in the chat. So the link is coming now. Okay, so I see most of you are done. So let's go back to the presentation. Oops, that's not what I want to share. Here we go. Okay, so what you have seen are two examples of the kind of post-production we can do, the kind of video editing we could do with Lightboard captures. So we're really talking about fixing imperfections here, right? Things that are slightly problematic, but maybe we don't want to go back to the studio to record something all over again. So we do these corrections to avoid re-recording. The edits themselves sometimes can be time consuming, but it's a matter of optimizing how to use the time, right? And then these are generally unnoticeable. Consider, like in the video, we zoomed in to really see what's going on, but imagine if that's part of a 10-minute video, nobody's gonna pick that up, especially if the audio is really strong. Sometimes the video doesn't need to be absolutely smooth if the audio is there to support it. And we can do many things, as I showed in the example. You can be splicing multiple takes, right? And, if you make a derivation and you make mistakes halfway through, right? Instead of re-recording the entire derivation, you can just erase like the second half of the derivation and start from there. And then we just splice the two videos together, and there you have the whole derivation. We could be correcting the audio, or we could even sometimes change up what's on the board as well. So that's one nice thing about Lightboard, right? Because the background is completely black. So there's a lot of things we can do there, taking advantage of that. Yes, and here's some of the tools we can use for post-production. So the second point I wanted to mention is how we deal with multimedia, right? So instead of just simply writing on the board, there's certainly the option, as Jim has shown, to put pre-made material onto the board. So that's done through chroma keys. Basically, you would just prepare a PowerPoint presentation. I won't get into the technical details, but whatever you can make into a PowerPoint, you can put that on Lightboard, and the presenter will be behind that material. So not in front, but behind, right? And you can also potentially juxtapose handwriting and pre-made material. For example, in this case, because I didn't think I could draw the coordinate systems perfectly on the board, so I decided to pre-make it in PDF form. But I also want to mention, we're making videos, so there's nothing wrong with adding things in post-production either, right? So for example, in this case, this is a MOOC on COVID transmission. So we actually, we're showing a bus where one of the earliest super spreading event happened. And yeah, we thought it'd be nice to show a picture of the bus and show where the cases are. But we didn't have the picture at the time of the recording, but that's okay. We can just record pretending that there's going to be an image there and then add it in post-production. And again, because of the background is perfectly black, it's really easy to think about what kind of graphics would go well with that kind of background. So one last point I wanted to make is how Lightboard truly lowers the barrier for instructors, not only faculty, but also even TAs and graduate students. So, and I get the sense that working with a lot of faculty in chemical engineering, that they're really open to just trying it out if they see the value in Lightboard, because it's so easy to explain what it is, right? It's very similar to conventional teaching. It's really easy to get people on board. And so here's a story featured actually on MIT Daily about 10 to 13, that's a course in chemical engineering, where Professor Chris Love, actually, he's a proponent of involving the students and the TAs into classroom teaching as well. So actually, MIT News made a short video, which I like to just play for you briefly here.
In previous, and so Chris Love was really the pioneer bringing MITx as a residential online learning component to aid what was going on in the classroom. And we had set it up to just run for the first 4 weeks of the semester. Our plan was to stop using that and continue as a normal class.
Yeah, just very briefly, obviously that's only, Lightboard was only one component of the class, but there you saw me, Professor Love, and a previous TA, Mark Payne, presenting material. And we were at the time thinking about involving students as well, but then COVID came, so we weren't able to do it. But imagine if we did that, the style would be quite consistent, right? It would be quite a consistent feel for all the different presenters, and it would have a professional look to it. So Lightboard is definitely a useful option if you're considering something like that. So with that, I'd like to take any questions.
Are there questions for Dr. Gu? Yes, Nick.
Yes, the question I was going to ask earlier is you brought it up, this inverted handedness. I'm curious, I'm assuming that as you're looking at the screen, it looks like the way you're writing it in front of you. But it was mentioned earlier that you have to pay attention to where you are relative to the camera. So does that mean that you have to kind of look and move in the opposite direction if you want to move around? Or what more? I'm interested more in the mechanics of how to not look clumsy.
Yes. So actually, further away from the glass, there's a TV screen, which is basically a mirror. You can think of it as a mirror, right? Just like when you look yourself in the mirror, if you move in one direction, the mirror actually shows what the students see. So for example, in this case, you see Professor Bazan holding the marker in his left hand, but he's actually right-handed, right? So this is really the mirror image of what's actually happening in the room. So, on the point of the handedness, right? If you want to explain the left-hand rule for the, coordinate system or taking the cross product, you'll be explaining it with your right hand with the same fingers. So it's a little bit confusing. And I had to do that at one point, and it was it was a little bit off-putting, but you get used to it, and it's not something you cannot circumvent.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Wait, can I speak specifically to that point? Molly, I'm jumping
Sure.
the queue, I recognize.
No worries.
Yeah, so this arises all the time in electromagnetism because you do a lot of things. There's a lot of right-hand rules in electromagnetism. There's one with your thumb like this, current this way, magnetic field that way. There's cross products, as you said. And so it didn't take long for me to get used to talking about the right-hand rule, but doing it with my left hand. And then so long as you keep talking about the right-hand rule, but doing it with your left hand, everything works out just fine. And so what really worries me is the next time I teach in the classroom, if I do that, I will confuse the class to no end, because basically I did enough Lightboard videos that I'm just used to that now. And it's going to mess me up the next time I teach electromagnetism in the physical classroom. So it wasn't hard. In some ways, it was too easy. The issue is going to be flipping back. And for someone like Peter Dermashkin, who is teaching in the classroom and then later in the same day recording Lightboard videos, that must be a challenge.
Thanks, Krishna. Paul Mende, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering two things. One is for Joey, just if you could say more about comparing tablet to Lightboard, because I've been using a tablet for teaching things remotely over Zoom, and I love the Lightboard look. So I was wondering a little bit more on that. Also, I was wondering if any of the people doing it could abstract a little away from the specific technology, because I could probably get my tablet without going into the studio to, have effects that look like the Lightboard. So when is that a good thing to do sort of pedagogically versus stuff that's prepared versus Blackboard? I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Sure, that's a great question. And I get that a lot from faculty, actually. So I would look at it in two areas. One is convenience. The other one is pedagogy, right? So when it comes to convenience, it really varies for different people. For some people, they just don't have a good microphone and they don't want to get one. So going to Lightboard is just the easier option. And maybe they don't have a quiet environment to record in, right? So that would make the Lightboard option more attractive. On the other hand, if you already have a tablet workflow and it works great for you, I think that's a very strong form of instruction as well. And you should definitely very strongly consider that. Except when you record on tablet, obviously there isn't what Jim was talking about, having the person behind the glass and looking at the different equations, which could be useful depending on what you teach. And on the point of pedagogy, yes, I think there are strong points about using a tablet versus using Lightboard. For example, you cannot easily annotate on a pre-made figure in Lightboard, right? Because I don't know if what Jim showed makes sense in the context, but whatever you superimpose on the Lightboard screen, you don't actually see that in front of you. It's on a TV screen, which shows the combined image of the slides you made plus your handwriting, but it's actually not on the glass in front of you, right? So you can't point at something that's on the slide, for example. You can only roughly point at the location, but you can't really annotate over it. It'll be like drawing on one piece of glass and then hoping it'll show up in the right place on the TV screen, right? So it's a little bit difficult for that, which I think if you're annotating a complex schematic I would do a tablet lecture. I think it's a stronger form of interaction than Whiteboard.
Thank you. George Stevens, do you have a question?
Yeah, one technical question. The Adobe tools you were talking about, are those free, available free through MIT IS&T?
They're now free for all faculty and students and staff at MIT. Previously they weren't, but just recently, yes, we all have access now.
All right, and then this maybe we can put into the more general discussion. This is kind of a general question. I mean, I've played around with the board and I've watched quite a few of them, and I find them just incredibly engaging. Much more so than watching somebody filmed writing on a blackboard, and much more so than seeing sort of a magic hand writing stuff on a tablet. And I'm just curious, because I'm certainly not in the cohort that all of our students are. I'm just wondering, you know, has there been some effort to get really detailed feedback from students, what their reaction is? Because every time the first time I watched it, I was just blown away. And every time I watch it after that, it doesn't get any less engaging.
Maybe I could jump in. I'm Mike Short over here, and I actually do have an answer to that, because I switched to synchronous Lightboard this semester, and about 3 weeks into the semester, and surveyed my students explicitly on that topic, and their answer was better than Blackboard. That kind of blew me away. It's kind of like what you said, George, that it is more engaging than the Blackboard, and the students seem to say so. And since they had 3 or 4 other classes with a mix of just talking at Zoom or iPad or et cetera, they all said that this really made the remote experience not just tolerable, but exciting. I never thought anyone would say that. And I credit the Lightboard for that too.
Mike, you're on my list of people to highlight. I'm so glad you're here. And I know you have a lot to share about sort of taking Lightboard to those next few steps. Would you like to tell a little bit of your experience and let people know what you've been doing and what you've created?
If now's the right time, sure. Yeah,
this is good. Yep.
Yeah. So let's see. I first got introduced to the Lightboard through Jim, I think, as we all did, recording some MITx modules. That's also another aspect, to go to George's question. What do students think about the Lightboard versus other things? My other co-instructors did shooting in the ODL studio, which came out fantastic, by the way. But my module is about half on the Lightboard, and we had 3,000 something learners. A lot of them commented on that fact in particular. And we're looking forward to the next cohort starting in like a week or so. So starting in the summer, I asked and finally got permission to build a Lightboard studio in my office, which I'm happy to show you guys. This gets at a question Jim had been asking, because I have a very small space. And it's kind of something that can show you can do a Lightboard in a very small space. Molly, I wonder if you could enable screen sharing, please.
Oh boy.
If not, that's okay. I can do it another time.
Oh yes, yeah. I need to make you a co-host. Yeah, hold on one moment.
Oh.
It's coming.
Okay, but I can explain in the meantime.
Okay.
So we finally got the kit about 3 weeks into the semester. It took me maybe 2 hours to put everything together. I got the stuff right from the spin out from University of Illinois, and the rest of it was from reuse, actually. So I hit the Stata Center dumpster pretty hard and got a whole bunch of power cables, confidence monitors, some black cloth and things, and turned my office into a very small sit-down synchronous Lightboard studio. So in addition to the asynchronous stuff, I did it all synchronously. Someone threw out a TV, so this way I was able to see what I look like. And going to what Krishna said, the left-right-handedness thing, yeah, it really freaks you out when you see yourself backwards. You use that. I use that to check contrast levels and that I don't look like a magician or anything. But that's what the whole studio looks like. It's like a sort of a 10 by 10 cube, and with the right camera focus and everything, it just perfectly fits. It wouldn't fit in any smaller space, but with this tabletop version, getting back to something that I forget who was saying, I can fill the board in about 30 to 40 minutes, and I do intro to nuclear physics. And I find the erasing, at least for part of the board, it only takes a minute. It's like Blackboard equivalent. I played around with which glass cleaners to use. There's some details I won't get into now. But it was absolutely transformative, and I don't want to go back. I'm dreading return to normal because it's not going to be as good.
Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing that. Do folks have questions for Professor Short?
I have a question for Mike. Could you say something about how much it cost?
Yes, the whole thing all in was $4,000. The light board itself was $2,900. I got 2 boxes to do the flipping and capture, which came out to about $600. I use my own, I have a DSLR camera that has an HDMI out. If you get a used one, you can get one for $400 or $500 that does the trick. The muslin cloth and other accoutrements were $50, and all the extras, monitors, wall-mounted laptops and stuff were courtesy of y'all. You threw them out and fixed them and put them together.
Thanks. Thanks, Mike. Peter Domashkin, would you like to share?
Yeah, just two things. Once you make a lot of Lightboard videos, and what's nice about it is one screen, 5 to, anywhere from 3 to 7 or 8 minutes. What we've been doing is we've been building learning sequences, combining these short videos with questions and problems. And so it becomes a asynchronous way to deliver information to the class. And I think it's an effective tool for doing that. The other thing is for Jim, are you building more studios? Because how do people actually reserve time in the studio? If a lot of people use it, it could be hard to reserve time. I was wondering if you could talk about what's going on there. And just before Jim speaks, the last little thing, John Brissom, this is just a little bit of MIT history, which is always kind of fun to hear. In the alley by Building 9, John was walking by me one day and I was walking the other way. And John said, "Have you heard of Lightboard?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Google Lightboard, I'll build it for you," as he was walking away. And that was sort of the origin of the Lightboard at MIT. And then Jim took it over and did a beautiful job in there. So I just thought I'd throw that little history story out.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Peter.
Peter.
In response to your question about the studio space, we were able to build 3 more studios since March. So we have 2 studios in classroom spaces, which the registrar's office has given us for at least the next semester. One is in building 36, which is where I am right now, and another one in building 13. And then chemical engineering has kindly donated one of their conference room spaces, at least temporarily, for a Lightboard studio. So that gives us a total of 5 studios, one of which IDSS uses exclusively.
Thanks. I know Aaron has some interesting things to say about pedagogy. I also just wanted to highlight a really cool thing that Sarah Thornton said in the chat. She's found a workaround for the difficulty of annotation. Once you have your image up on the screen, before you start filming, you put a small black marker dot on the glass at the place where you want to write or circle. And then once you start filming, you can quickly find that location and the audience doesn't see the black dot. So Aaron, go ahead, please share.
Yeah, so I just want to follow up on the question that George had asked, and what is it that we can study about how people engage with this, how students engage with it? And there's a bunch of work being done in this very area. So in the chat, I'm going to post a EdSurge article that goes to a journal article, Journal on Educational Psychology. And basically the idea is that the embodiment, the fact that students can actually read social cues, so much of the learning process is reading those social cues, where we look with our eyes, where we point, where we come out of that, as Jim pointed out early on. It has some really invaluable aspects to the learning process for students. And we're starting to see evidence of that being reported out in the actual educational research areas as well. So that's just sort of follow up to that. The other thing I'll say is so much of it is also about how you connect that with the culture of your classroom. I think one of the things that having conversations with people who record Lightboards is that it's an extension of what they feel like they're doing with their students in their class. It's that sort of moving the learning community beyond just the 4 walls and making it feel more authentic to them as they record as well. And that that authenticity often comes through in the way that students receive the videos as well. It doesn't feel overproduced. It doesn't feel like something that is extra and beyond. It feels like that authentic interaction that the students get with faculty in their face-to-face interactions as well. So I think those are important pieces to remember as you consider how you record the videos and interact.
Thank you. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about how you coordinate and the safety protocols for Lightboard?
Sure. There's a couple of points I wanted to mention beyond that, but let me go ahead and address the COVID safety protocols. Currently, studio space is reserved on a daily basis, meaning that we can only have one lecture per day in a space. Now we've made it a little bit easier to capture by making it a little bit more self-service friendly by having a simple keypad that allows you to start and stop captures. And then there's a minimal amount of administrivia wrapped around pushing these videos up to either Dropbox or whatever your favorite video source is. On top of that, we've also have the capability to have a person remote into the capture workstation so they can be on a laptop either outside of the studio, across campus, or even in my case, 30 miles off campus, and still control a capture so that the talent, the lecturer, doesn't really have to think about much except for the content that they're presenting. So we do have a means to start and stop and moderate that capture from outside the room. There were two other points that I wanted to mention. One was an anecdotal point about how students respond to the Lightboard videos. And I've had a lot of students pre-COVID walk by the studio when the studio door was open and just stop and stare and look inside and say, oh, this is where it happens. This is where Peter Damashkin is teaching. And I said, yep, this is the spot. So they'll hang out for a few minutes, experiment on the Lightboard, and then tell me about various things that they've seen in the physics class. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I believe it was Paul asked a question about the difference between a tablet capture and a Lightboard. I'm completely biased. The tablet captures, Khan Academy captures, I find they are interesting, especially if the content is valuable, but I find them less engaging. Sometimes it's difficult to tell what someone's talking about if they're not moving the stylus around. Having said that, there is value in that type of capture, especially if you're more comfortable with that workflow, as Joey mentioned. And the other thing I would mention is we actually have had people come into the Lightboard studio with their tablet. And specifically, I'm thinking of Professor Gareth McKinley out of mechanical engineering, using an iPad and Notability and just annotating directly on the iPad and then compositing that image on the screen next to him. So that he can put a bunch of text up there, go through it, annotate. Those annotations appear on that second video feed next to him. And that's kind of a workaround in terms of being able to use a tablet style capture and the Lightboard Studio. So.
Thank you, Jim. Any other questions or comments? Actually, here's one from Kim Vandiver. How do you work in hands-on demos? How do you work in a hands-on demo? You want to speak to that, Jim?
Sure. In fact, I'll go back to Gareth McKinley. He's actually capturing stuff for a fluid mechanics course right now. And he has wheeled in several experiments. And we just shoot those normally like you would in a studio. Sometimes we leave the framing just as it is if the experiment is large enough. In his case, sometimes it can be a little bit challenging if he's working with clear fluids like water. So we might have to add some lighting to highlight that object. But yeah, it's not very much, it's not that challenging. In fact, it adds a lot of interest for me because it's something different than just a normal chalk talk. But it's very easy to integrate that into Lightboard Studio.
Great, thank you. Well, maybe this is a good time to wrap things up. I just wanted to thank Anna Friebel, Augustin Rayo, Joey Gu, and Jim Kane for everything they shared. And thank you all for what you contributed. I also owe a huge thanks to some technical behind the stage people. Steve Nelson and Gillian Welsh made sure that things ran smoothly behind the scenes, and I want to thank them. So, so come to more X Talks. Stay safe, you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.